So in the last week, Ukraine erased 3 months of Russian gains. Just like that. All of the progress celebrated by Russia in the south, gone in a matter of days. So let's get into what we know so far, the Russian response, and what is likely playing out right now. Now, starting out with an analysis here from Clement Molin that will be linked in the description below. He says, quote, after several weeks of counterattacks, the Ukrainian army has regained control of large disputed territories, including 12 villages in the east of the Zaporizhia Oblast. The Russian army has been pushed back. He says the Ukrainians used significant mechanized resources, a first in several months, taking advantage in particular of the poor weather conditions and the suspension of Starlink, which prevents drones from flying. These assaults took place to the west of Ternivate. Now, shifting over to a map to give you an idea of the area we're talking about here, we've got Deep State map pulled up. The Zaporizhia Oblast is kind of the southernmost area where we are seeing any sort of maneuver on the ground, right? So when you go further west of that, you end up against the Dnieper, Kherson, and there's just nobody crossing that water body, not for a while now. So zooming into Zaporizhia, this area in the northeast is the pocket that we've seen a significant number of Ukrainian advances in recent days. Now, Molin calls out that because of the suspension of Starlink, which no doubt played into this, that Russian drones are not able to fly. I'd push back on that a little bit. Russian drones are still flying all across the front. Starlink has disrupted communications and has impacted the use of some drones. There were certain kind of medium range and long range drones that were coming with attached Starlink terminals, but there's still a lot of Russian drone capabilities still being utilized today. So I don't want to give the impression that the Ukrainian advance in this area has been easy or has not been contested. Now, turning back to Molin, he says, in reality, the army has mainly cleared territories that were not under Russian control. It must be understood that there is not one front line, but two. The Ukrainian line and the Russian line, in the middle, a gray zone contested 5 to 15 kilometers wide. The width of such a zone is explained by the deployment of hundreds of Russian soldiers towards a near certain death, advancing as far as possible through fields, forests, and villages to destabilize the outnumbered Ukrainian rear lines. Thus, among the villages retaken in recent weeks, most only had a diffuse Russian presence, a few soldiers at most, which they used as a transit zone to push the gray zone further away. Others even had Ukrainian soldiers. And we have seen, the theme of the last 6+ months has been video after video after video of individual Russian soldiers trying to cross this gray zone. They're not moving in formation. In fact, these small scale, all things considered, armored assaults, when we see 2 to 5 vehicles at a time, even when they're pickups and motorcycles, are becoming rarer and rarer. What has been the theme for a while now is Russian soldiers dropped off 5, 10, 15 kilometers behind this gray zone, and they're walking forward either individually or in pairs. And we're seeing just a lot of those getting hunted down and killed by Ukrainian drone operators. So this gray zone that Molin is talking about is something we're going to go into further depth later in today's video, where I think there's a really good assessment of what this actually means for modern warfare. Now, I'll put up a map here put together by Clement Molin to kind of outline where this is currently taking place, because it's not being reflected right now on kind of public mapping services, kind of the traditional ones when you look at Deep State or Live UA Map or Rybar or even Suryak. We're not seeing this progress updated as rapidly. So looking at Molin's map here, he says the counterattack is unfolding in 2 main directions and has enabled an advance of 5 to 10 kilometers into the gray zone. The Ukrainians have deployed their assault brigades, which regularly play the role of firefighters, to clear out the presence of a few Russian soldiers, as in Dobropillia last summer, in Kupyansk, in Avdiivka, in Pokrovsk, in Stepnorysk. This is the strategy that we have seen Ukraine put together to counter the Russian infiltration tactics. And we've been fortunate at this point to have interviews with a couple different Ukrainian soldiers taking part in those operations, where it's a small strike group, an assault detachment, call it squad to platoon size, maybe 12, upwards of 20 at times. And they push through. They have very, very, very detailed intelligence of the area they're moving into, and they have a set objective. Move through this series of buildings, clear to here, and stop, and then pause and regroup. But they are flushing the Russians out of some of these areas. And it's not like a hasty counterattack that you might expect in a situation like this when the Russians get overextended, as they have in multiple areas of the front. but instead a very carefully planned, very heavily resourced, very deliberate set clearance operation. We, again, as Moline mentioned, we've seen this play out in multiple areas, and it does look like that's what we're seeing right now in the Zaporizhia direction. He says the western access enabled the Ukrainian army using armored vehicles across multiple axes to clear the small town of Ternivate, where a few Russian soldiers had infiltrated, and to regain control of the 2024 defensive line, obsolete but equipped with useful obstacles, and the banks of the Haicher River. Now, the full question is whether the Ukrainian advance will continue further south and therefore move out of the gray zone to enter the area that was under Russian control. The village of Uspinivka, which is the center of the Russian defensive setup, could become an objective. So to give you an idea of what he's talking about here, we're seeing a lot of the movement here to the north and a bit to this kind of northwestern tip near Ternivate. The area he's referring to as kind of the hub of Russian offensive and defensive operations in this area, Uspinivka, right here in the center. So kind of going back to how he's describing this is a lot of the operation so far has been reclaiming this gray zone that we've said it in multiple videos and for quite a while now. Russia is very quick to claim progress and to claim territorial control when that's just not the case. So there's a lot of these areas where, look, the Russian soldier that was there that claimed territorial control 2 weeks ago might have been hit by a drone last week and the maps weren't updated. So pushing through there, probably you're not going to encounter a lot of Russian resistance. And we'll come back to this later in today's video, but there's some of these areas where forces are interspersed. So Ukraine is, quote, clearing an area where there's Ukrainian soldiers holed up in a basement holding that position. It's just a weird situation along the front right now. But we have to wait and see if there's any realistic possibility of Ukraine pushing even further. Moline does go into the consequences here. He says, first of all, the good result of the last few days undermined nearly 3 months of the Russian army's offensive, which has made this sector a priority. The front line is moving further away from Zaporizhia, but also from the main lines of defense currently under construction. So, of course, as the Russians get pushed back, it offers Ukraine the ability to further reinforce areas back from the front. So as Russia continues to advance, they're running into more advanced, more lethal defensive measures. I'm going to be a little hesitant to say what this means big picture or what this means long term because I'm not entirely confident in the reporting we're getting at this point. It's just there's a lot of unknowns right now. We're seeing what appears to be a counterattack. Again, these assault type units taking advantage of Russia being overextended. What we don't know is the extent to which that operation is played out. We don't know the extent of Ukrainian units that have been involved. We don't know the total losses, and we don't know the change of territorial control. So it's very hard as we sit here today on February 15th to really make any determination on how far this will go or what this will mean for the larger war. Now, from the Russian side, they're pushing back mostly, and it does look like some of the analysts, to include the Russian Ministry of Defense themselves, may have gotten caught with their pants down, kind of overextending, over-exaggerating Russian claims. Yuri Podolyalik, never get that one right, Russian mill blogger here, actually says the Ukrainians have not been effective. They've been stopped all across the front. He said, quote, the past 24 hours have shown that the armed forces of Ukraine's assault corps not only failed to achieve the successes it needed, but is also clearly no longer capable of serious counteroffensive actions. The losses they suffered earlier are taking their toll, and the units of the Russian armed forces were clearly prepared, and they were able to impose their own counterplay on the opponent. And even the fog, along with the disconnection of Starlink, did not tip the balance in favor of the opponent. That is rather contradictory with what we've seen from a lot of other Russian mill bloggers and what we're seeing from the evidence on the ground at this point, but pretty strong assessment from the Russian side that not only was Ukraine not effective here at all, they're actually stopped. And continuing on with that, the Russian Ministry of Defense took this a step further, saying not only was Ukraine completely stopped all across the front, Russia's back on the attack and gaining territory. In fact, just earlier today, so shifting on the map here, got the Zaporizhia direction. Up here, upper right, is the area where Ukraine has been pushing. When we shift down here to the bottom left, the southwest corner, check this out. This is what Russia put out today. They said that 3 new areas have come under Russian control. Primorsky, here, northwest. No way I'm going to get this right. Maldanivka and Zapazne. So these 2 areas that, according to Deep State map, are 10, 15 kilometers still from the Russian front lines, The Russian Ministry of Defense today said that those are taken. In fact, let's go over to Suryak map that tends to be much more favorable to Russian advances. Even they don't have this marked as coming under Russian control or even in some sort of gray zone. So not entirely sure where that Russian claim is coming from, but it does kind of line up with these exaggerations that we've seen across the front for some time. In fact, Russian mill blogger Two Majors kind of spoke to this today, where he said, quote, "The entry of 2 attack aircraft into a village does not mean its capture. If the commander knew how they were being fooled and how losses were being stretched out over time, he would have torn everyone apart." Again, this idea that a single Russian soldier moves through the lines and then all of a sudden that becomes territory controlled by Russia is a major issue that we're seeing all across the front right now. These infiltration type tactics are very, very effective at that, but they might not be all that effective big picture because we're seeing the drawbacks of exaggerating those claims or pinning your hopes on that one soldier cut off from everyone else 10 kilometers behind the front lines. Sometimes that doesn't work out well in Russia's favor. And we're going to get into that with some gray zone assessments here from another analyst called Vitaly over on X. But first, I want to do a quick update on this fundraiser that we're rocking for Car for Ukraine, moving this thing along at 76,000, almost 77,000 euros out of a 97,000 euro goal. Look, the reason I teamed up with these guys again, I've worked with them once before at the end of last year. Cars are such an important item in Ukraine right now, and it's one that is not easily taken care of. So there's a shortage of vehicles in Ukraine, and what we see time and time again is soldiers try desperately to get vehicles to do any number of things, right? Move guys to and from the front, evacuate casualties, move equipment, resupply their people. And it's easy for them, to be blunt, like it's easy for them to get scammed or purchase a vehicle for, say, $3,000 US because that's what they're able to raise. But then once it's delivered, they find out it needs $7,000 worth of repairs, right? Or just completely breaks down and becomes entirely useless. And now the soldier of the unit that received this gift vehicle is on the hook for thousands of dollars of repairs before they can even use it, and they don't have that money. So long way around to say Car for Ukraine, awesome organization. They have now delivered over 800 vehicles. And what they do, they've already, for this campaign, they've already secured, I want to say 9 total vehicles that are standing by, waiting for us to wrap this up so they can make the purchase and then get into fixing them up. So they'll add armor inside of the vehicles, modified armor based off what the unit wants. They'll do all of the repairs and make sure these things are ready to go. So when they show up to the unit, they can send them directly into the fight. So awesome organization, doing a really good job, and in interacting with the soldiers that have been on the receiving end of these vehicles, they love it. They know they're getting a high-quality vehicle that is going to be useful the minute they get it and not break down like, unfortunately, so many are. So for those interested and able to contribute to this fundraiser for the 104th Territorial Defense Brigade, we've got awesome patches here, I think, and a very nice video from the commander of that unit in the link in the description and the pinned comment. But shifting back over here to this assessment of the gray zone from an analyst on Twitter called Vitaly, I'll link his work in the description as well. Look, if you get a chance, these guys are there's the lifeblood of kind of understanding what's going on in the war. Guys like Vitaly, Plyfra, we've quoted multiple times, Thorkill, I'm going to put all these guys down below, and then Clement Molin. I had somebody recently ask, are there Ukrainian mill bloggers? Because we don't really use that term with Ukraine, but like that's where I would put these guys in that camp, right? They're either posting in English or they're in NATO countries, and they're providing incredibly detailed, incredibly important analysis of the front. So if you're on these different platforms, be sure to go check these guys out. Subscribe, give them a follow. So Vitaly here talking about the gray zone, I think brought up a really good, important point here. And when we look at the map, this is one of the reasons that I think, we've talked about this before, one of the reasons I think Deep State does such a good job is a while ago they started referring to these areas as gray, not just red controlled by Russia or uncolored or green controlled by Ukraine, but recognizing that across the entirety of the front, there is not a point where it is Russian control and then you go one street over and it's Ukrainian control. That does not exist anymore in this war. Vitaly says, quote, "The concept of a front line as understood throughout military history has fundamentally ceased to exist in the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. In its place has emerged what military analysts now call the gray zone, a fluid, contested space where traditional offensive operations have become prohibitively expensive and where control is measured not in territory held, but the ability to observe, strike, and survive." Now, I've got a couple different pushbacks here with his assessment. Overall, I think it's spot on, but I'm going to save those till the end because I think it's worth running through all of this. He says, what emerges from this dynamic is a peculiar form of territorial control that is simultaneously meaningless and essential. A position occupied by a three-man team in a concealed burrow controls its immediate surroundings, though not through firepower or defensive strength, but simply through its presence. As long as someone is alive and has not surrendered, the territory is considered held. The Russians, themselves facing severe personnel shortages, are reluctant to push forward against even token resistance when it means exposing their forces to observation and strike. Real quick, Russia does have a manpower issue. It's in a very different situation than the Ukrainian manpower issue. But we're seeing, first off, last month, Russia lost more soldiers killed and seriously wounded than they were able to bring into the military. That's a manpower issue. You just want to stop right there. That's a problem that Russia's going to have to overcome. And we're also seeing them kind of go further and further down the socioeconomic ladder to be able to lure people into the military. So there is a manpower issue in Russia. By and large, it's not a shortage, but it's getting people into the military at the rate that they need them right now. He says this creates the paradox of symbolic control. Positions matter because they force the enemy to acknowledge their presence and dedicate resources to monitoring them, yet they hold virtually no tactical value in themselves. The actual capability to influence events comes from the drone networks overhead, not the soldiers huddled in holes on the ground. In this environment, the definition of mission success has been redefined. For infantry holding positions in the gray zone, the objective is not to inflict casualties, seize territory, or achieve any traditionally understood military goal. The objective is simply to survive. Now, I think that is the tactical objective, and that's what we're seeing. I mean, how many of the it's wild at this point, right? Again, the individual Russian soldiers moving across the front. This tactic of infiltration is very, very difficult for Ukraine to stop 100%, and we've seen it be effective against the Ukrainian lines in multiple directions. Like arguably everywhere that Russia has pushed through this infiltration tactic, it is working to some degree. Of course, quoting Uno, the soldier in Azov International, talking about this a few months ago, infiltration is an excellent tactic if you don't care about losses. And that's what's happening. But then once they get there, the goal is simply to not die. That's it. Continuing on here with Vitaly, he says, those who survive become strategic assets precisely because their survival pins enemy forces in place, consumes enemy resources for surveillance and strike attempts, and denies the enemy the psychological victory of clearing a sector. Survival is resistance. Resistance denies symbolic control, and symbolic control in a war of attrition fought under conditions of mutual transparency may be the only form of control that ultimately matters. Now, this is where I'll push back on this a little bit. My gut says, or my assessment is that the reason that survival is the focus, first off, I think that's a tactical objective. I don't know that it necessarily maps to the strategic level. I think it is a tactical necessity is how Russia is going about this, and it's a gamble. No doubt that Russia is playing out here. They know that they cannot push large-scale armored assaults to try to take territory. That just means more losses in a shorter period of time. What they've chosen to do instead is a lot of small losses drug out over a longer period of time, recognizing that with that comes smaller gains. And the gamble here is when you call it 50% of the soldiers get through and huddle in basements in Zaporizhia or Kupyansk or Pokrovsk or wherever it might be. It gives you that immediate victory. And we see this on Russian Telegram channels and from the Russia crowd, where every single day they are talking about new Russian advances. And they get to do that with this tactic because they've got that one Russian soldier that has moved forward. But it is such a gamble, as we're seeing right now in Zaporizhia, as we saw a couple months ago in Kupyansk, as we saw this last summer in Dobropillia. You get to say we are advancing, we are advancing, we are advancing, we are constantly taking more territory. But in the drop of a hat, when Ukraine notices that they are overextended and that territorial control is actually 6 Russian soldiers holed up in basements across a 10 square kilometer area, it takes, I don't want to downplay this, but overall a relatively small scale operation to completely wipe that out. Just focusing attention, focusing resources can wipe out all of that progress. And as we're seeing here, a matter of days. So I don't know. I would say that is a strategic gamble. Like, if Russia continues, and we saw in Kupyansk where Putin himself chimed in and said, we now control the entire city. I would argue that tactic being employed in Kupyansk that led to the president of Russia saying that they controlled a city that they did not, and subsequently losing almost all of it to Ukrainian forces was a strategic blunder. So to me, this infiltration tactic, the introduction of these gray zones across the front is a necessity for Russia. The survival of the troops behind Ukrainian lines is a thorn in the side of Ukrainian forces, no doubt, because they have to deal with that. You cannot just, we've talked to guys in the past where they said, one of these dudes gets through, you find out he's back there, everything stops. Because all of a sudden that one guy can ambush logistical routes, can come in behind some of your drone operator positions. So even if they're not doing that, the fact that they can is a serious disruption. So it is an effective tactical objective. I don't know right now that this actually translates to operational or even strategic success, but that's what we'll have to see. And that's going to be one of the major takeaways here in the Zaporizhia direction. What comes after the third, fourth, or fifth time Ukraine pushes back and recaptures some of this territory that was very tenuously held by Russia in the first place. But that's all we got for now. Again, for those interested and able, the link to support the 104th Territorial Defense Brigade will be in the description below. But thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.